A woman with no name, a man with no mercy, and a ranch that became a battlefield. She appeared at the edge of his land like something the desert had chewed up and spat out, bruised, bleeding, and carrying a silence so heavy it bent the air around her. He'd buried his heart years ago and swore nothing would dig it up. But when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see weakness. He saw a war. And somewhere, deep in the chest of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to fight for another human being, something shifted. This woman was running from something, and whatever it was coming for his ranch next. If this story moves you, drop a like and comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The summer that nearly broke Rhett Calloway started the same way every summer did in that part of Wyoming, with silence, heat, and the particular kind of loneliness that only makes itself known when a man has been alone long enough to stop noticing it. The Calloway Ranch sat 11 miles from the nearest town on a stretch of highway so straight and empty it looked like God had drawn a line through the earth just to prove he could. Red rock formations jutted out of the pale earth to the west. The Bighorn foothills rolled dark and blue to the north. And in every other direction, nothing. Just grass and sky, and the occasional hawk riding the thermals like it owned the whole sorry world. Rhett owned 2,000 acres of it, 12 horses, 47 head of cattle, a smokehouse that had been standing since his grandfather built it in 1947, a main house with a porch that creaked like a confession, and 6 ranch hands who showed up every morning before dawn and didn't ask questions because questions were one of the things Rhett Calloway did not tolerate on his land. He was a big man. Not tall in the way that made people look up at you, but wide and solid in the way that made them step back. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent 30 years arguing with the earth and winning more often than not. His hair had gone gray at the temples sometime in his late 30s, and he hadn't bothered to fight it. His face was the kind of face that weather makes, not ugly exactly, but marked, carved. Like the landscape around him, it had been shaped by forces that didn't particularly care what the final result looked like. He was 42 years old, and he lived alone, and he intended to keep it that way until the land itself swallowed him up. The morning Mara Ellison walked up through his road, Rhett was fixing a busted section of fence line along the eastern pasture. It was barely 7 a.m., but the heat was already sitting on the land like a physical weight. His shirt was soaked through, his hat was pulled low. He was on his knees in the red dirt, working a post back into its rightful place with the kind of focused aggression he usually reserved for things that couldn't fight back. When Hector Vega, his longest-serving hand, a compact and unreadable man from Sonora, came riding up on his roan mare with an expression that Rhett had never seen on his face before. Hector didn't rattle. In 11 years of working together, Rhett had seen Hector walk through a barn fire with the calm of a man checking the mail. So when the man pulled up his horse and hesitated before speaking, Rhett set down his pliers. "What?" "There's a woman," Hector said, "coming up the main road." Rhett squinted toward the east where the access road ran a long, shimmering mile from the highway to the ranch gate. "Coming from where?" "Walking." "Walking." "Yes, sir." Rhett stood up slowly, pressing one hand to his lower back. He looked east. Even from this distance, he could make out the dark shape of a figure against the pale road, moving slowly, unevenly. "She limping?" Rhett asked. "She is." He picked up his hat from the fence post, brushed the dust from the brim, and put it back on. "Any vehicle on the highway? Broken down?" "Nothing." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his pliers, dropped them in the tool belt, and said, "Get the others back to their work." "And you?" "I'll handle it." He drove his truck down the access road at a crawl, giving himself time to study her before she had a chance to study him. She was young. That was the first thing he registered. 20-something, maybe early 30s, though it was hard to tell because of what the road and the sun had done to her face. She was wearing jeans that had been expensive once, and a plain cotton shirt, gray, so damp with sweat it was nearly black across her back. Her dark hair was pulled into a knot at the base of her neck, but half of it had come loose and hung against the side of her face, which she didn't bother to push back. She had a canvas bag slung across one shoulder, and even from 50 yards, he could see she was working hard to make the limp less obvious. She kept her chin level. She kept her eyes forward. He pulled up beside her and she stopped walking. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach out to the truck for support, though he could see from the set of her jaw that stopping was a relief her body was desperate for. He leaned out the window. "You lost?" he said. "No." Her voice was steadier than he expected, lower than he expected. "You headed somewhere specific, or just walking till you fall over?" Her jaw tightened. She looked up at him directly for the first time, and he saw two things at once: that her left eye was ringed with a bruise in the particular shade of yellow-green that meant it was at least 4 or 5 days old, and that her eyes themselves were very dark and very still, and contained the kind of guarded intelligence that a person only develops if they've learned the hard way that trust is a currency you can't afford to spend carelessly. "I heard there was a working ranch out this way," she said, "looking for work." "This is a cattle ranch," he said, "not a hotel." "I didn't ask for a room. I asked for work." He looked at her for a long moment. The heat pressed down. Somewhere across the pasture, one of the horses screamed, just briefly, a high, sharp sound, then nothing. "You got a name?" he said. "Mara." "Mara what?" A pause, 1 second too long. "Ellison," she said. He tapped his thumb against the door of the truck once, twice. "Mara Ellison. Where you from, Mara Ellison?" "Nowhere that matters." "Who did that to your eye?" "Nobody who'll do it again." He held her gaze for another 4 full seconds. Then he pushed open the passenger door. "Get in. You can rest while I decide whether to drive you back to the highway." She didn't say thank you. She climbed in, set her bag on the floor between her feet, and looked straight ahead through the windshield. Her breathing was controlled and deliberate, and he recognized it as the breathing of someone in pain who has made a decision not to show it. He drove her back up the access road in silence. He put her in the smokehouse. It hadn't been used for its original purpose in years, since Rhett's father had run the operation, actually. Now it was a small outbuilding at the edge of the main yard, with stone walls that stayed cool even in July heat. A cot in the corner left over from when the previous foreman had needed an extra bunk, a wash basin, and a single window that faced west and caught the last of the evening light. It wasn't much. It was a roof and a wall, and a door with a latch. And from the way she looked around the small space without comment or complaint, he understood that these things meant more to her than she was going to let on. "There's a basin," he said from the doorway. "Pump handle outside. Privy is around the north side of the main barn. You'll eat with the hands if you stay. You'll work if you eat. Those are the only terms on offer." "What would the work be?" she asked. "Whatever needs doing. You ever work a cattle ranch before?" "No." "Then you'll start at the bottom." He studied her. "That ankle's swollen." She said nothing. "I'll send Hector over with a wrap. You use it or you don't. Your choice. But I need people who can stand up and stay standing. You've got tonight to rest. Tomorrow you prove you're useful, or tomorrow you're gone. Understood?" She met his eyes. "Understood." He turned to leave, then stopped. "What are you running from?" he said. The question landed in the room like a stone into still water. She didn't answer immediately. And when she did, it was with the specific economy of someone who has learned to say only exactly what they must. "Something I won't let catch me," she said. Rhett looked at her one more time. Then he put on his hat, stepped back out into the hammer of the sun, and pulled the door closed behind him. That night, after the hands had eaten and the bunkhouse had gone quiet, Rhett sat on his porch with a glass of water he'd barely touched and stared out at the dark land and thought about his wife. Laura had been dead 9 years. A car accident on the county road, black ice, a logging truck, the kind of ordinary violent end that has no meaning and offers no comfort. They had been married 6 years when it happened. They had been trying for a child. In the weeks that followed her death, Rhett had discovered that grief has a specific physical texture. It is not soft, like people say. It is hard-edged. It catches on things inside you as it moves through, and it tears. He had rebuilt himself around the absence, rebuilt himself into a man who needed very little, expected less, and gave nothing away. The ranch had become not just his livelihood, but his entire architecture, every hour filled, every morning purposeful, no space left for anything that could be taken. He was not a cruel man, but he had become a closed one. He thought about the woman in the smokehouse, the bruise around her eye, the way she'd looked at him in the truck, not with fear, which he'd braced himself for, but with assessment. Measuring him the way an experienced person measures a fence, looking for where it was most likely to give. Whatever she was running from, he thought, she hadn't been running long enough to be broken by it, but she'd been in it long enough for it to leave marks. He went inside without finishing his water and went to bed and didn't sleep well, which was not unusual. She was up before any of the hands the next morning. When Rhett came out of the main house at 5:45 to make his pre-dawn round, he found her in the main yard, moving quietly between the fence posts near the horse barn, studying the set of the rails with her fingers, pressing along the wood with the focused attention of someone who knew what rot looked like and where it hid. He stopped and watched her. She hadn't heard him yet. She worked her way along the fence line methodically, checking each post, each rail, each connection. When she found a section that moved slightly under her hands, she stopped, crouched down despite what that must have cost her ankle, and examined the base of the post where it met the ground. "That one's been soft for 2 weeks," Rhett said. She looked over her shoulder at him, unhurried. "It's not just soft. The rot's gone about 8 inches up from the base. The next 2 posts on either side are starting too. If you get a horse pressing against this section," she stood, brushing her palms together, "it'll go down." He walked over and pressed his hand against the post she'd indicated. It moved more than it should have. "Hector keeps telling me it's low priority," Rhett said. "Hector's probably right that it's not urgent in the next few days," she said. "But it's not 2 weeks out either." She paused. "I can fix it if you want. I know how to set posts." He looked at her. The ankle was still wrapped. She'd used the bandage he'd sent over, which he noted. In the early morning light, without the full force of the sun, she looked less wrecked than she had on the road. Still thin, still carrying something heavy in the set of her shoulders. But there was a precision to how she moved that hadn't been visible the day before. A competence, barely concealed. "Where'd you learn to work a fence?" he said. "Pick things up," she said. He recognized the pattern, asked where she came from, got a non-answer. He let it sit. "Grab the post hole digger from the equipment shed," he said finally. "I'll show you where the replacement posts are stacked." "I know what a post hole digger looks like," she said. "I didn't say you didn't." She walked toward the shed. He watched her for a moment, the slight hitch in her gait, the way she absorbed it without comment. And then he went to get his coffee and start the rest of his morning. The ranch hands did not make her welcome. This was not cruelty, exactly. It was caution. Rhett ran a careful operation, and his men had absorbed that carefulness into their own personalities. They were not unfriendly people, but they were selective with their trust, and a strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere and taken up residence in the smokehouse without any visible backstory or credentials was not, on its face, a trustworthy thing. Danny Cole, the youngest of the hands at 24, was openly skeptical in the way that only young men who haven't yet been tested can afford to be. He was good-natured and hard-working, and he said things out loud that the others only thought. On Mara's second day, she was helping the men move a section of portable fencing across the north pasture, dragging panels across dry, uneven ground in the full afternoon heat. Danny watched her struggle with a heavier section for about 30 seconds before he said, "You sure you're built for this kind of work, ma'am? No offense." Mara didn't look up from what she was doing. She shifted her grip on the panel, adjusted her angle, and used her body weight as a lever in a way that immediately moved the section more efficiently than Danny had been managing. "Looks like I'm managing," she said evenly. A couple of the other hands laughed. Danny turned red but didn't sulk about it, which Rhett, watching from across the yard, noted in the young man's favor. The other hands fell into a watchful neutrality. Hector, who was neither warm nor cold toward anyone on principle, gave her a long look on her second evening that might have been the beginning of respect. Boyd Emmons, the eldest of the crew at 58, a lanky Texan who had been with the ranch since Rhett's father's time, said nothing to her at all for the first 3 days. But on the 4th morning, he walked past where she was working on the fence repair. She'd replaced 4 posts by herself using materials she'd sourced correctly from the lumber stack without being told which was which. And he stopped. "You angle the post right," he said, which from Boyd was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She looked up. "Saw how the originals were set. Tried to match it." He nodded once and kept walking. At night, Rhett found himself aware of the light in the smokehouse window in a way he hadn't expected. Not with any particular emotion he could name, not longing, not suspicion, exactly. More like the awareness you develop for a sound that has no identifiable source, a presence registered by the periphery. He told himself it was caution, good management of a situation. She was a stranger with unexplained injuries and a story full of holes, and he owed it to his operation and his people to remain alert. He also told himself, with less conviction, that the fact she had been right about the fence posts, and about the specific way the three adjacent ones were starting to go, which he confirmed by checking on his own, meant nothing beyond the ordinary competence of someone who paid attention. What bothered him, if he was being honest, was something less tangible. It was the quality of her silence. Most people, when they didn't talk, were still loud, with fidgeting, with expressions, with the low-grade noise of wanting to be perceived. Mara was genuinely quiet. She occupied whatever space she was in without trying to expand into it or explain herself within it. It was the quiet of someone who had spent a long time learning how to take up as little room as possible. And there was something in that, in the discipline of it, in the specific skill it represented, that Rhett could recognize because it was something he had spent years practicing himself. He understood, in some wordless and precise way, that this woman had been trained out of her own presence, that someone had spent a long time teaching her that the safest thing she could be was invisible. The thought made him set his jaw in the darkness of his porch. On the fifth day, something happened that shifted the atmosphere of the ranch permanently. It was mid-afternoon. The sun was at its worst, beating flat and white out of a cloudless sky. Most of the hands were working on the far side of the property, bringing in a section of fence to be repaired. Mara was in the main yard, stacking lumber that had been delivered that morning, when a commotion broke out from the direction of the corral. She heard the shout first, a single sharp cry of pain, and then the sound of a horse going sideways, hooves against hard dirt. She was already moving before she'd made any conscious decision to move. Danny Cole was on the ground beside the corral fence, which had given way under the pressure of a spooked mare. The horse had shied hard into the fence, a loose board had splintered and cracked, and one of the protruding nails, long and rust orange, had caught Danny's hand as the board whipped around. The wound was bad. His right hand was gushing blood from the web of flesh between thumb and forefinger, and from the way he was cradling his wrist, two of his fingers were not tracking correctly. Hector was there already, crouched beside the boy, applying pressure with his bandana, looking up at the sound of Mara's running footsteps with an expression caught between relief and uncertainty. "How bad?" she said, already dropping to a knee beside Danny. "Hand," Hector said. "The nail caught him sideways. I see it." She was already reaching. "Let me look." She moved Hector's hand gently but precisely and examined the wound without any of the flinching or hesitation that the sight of that much blood would produce in most people. Her face was focused, still. "Danny," she said, "look at me." Danny, white as chalk, sweating cold, dragged his eyes up to her face. "You're okay," she said, with the particular firmness of someone who is not offering comfort so much as a directive. "The bleeding is bad, but it's not arterial. The fingers," she pressed carefully along the edges. "These two are dislocated, not broken. Do you understand what that means?" "Means it hurts like hell," Danny managed. "It means we can fix this without a hospital if you can hold still." She looked up at Hector. "I need clean cloth. As much as you have, and 2 straight pieces of wood about this long." She held her fingers apart by roughly 6 inches. "Thin ones, from the lumber stack." Hector was gone and back in under 2 minutes. He was not a man who needed things repeated twice. What happened next stopped every ranch hand who had begun to gather at a dead halt. Working with the precision and efficiency of someone who had done this before, not once, but many times, Mara cleaned the wound with water from the trough, packed and bound it to slow the bleeding, and then with swift and extraordinarily careful manipulation, relocated Danny's 2 dislocated fingers. She talked Danny through every second of it, holding his attention on her voice rather than his hand, and when it was done, she splinted the fingers against the wood with strips of cloth and tied off the whole construction neatly. She sat back on her heels. Danny was shaking but conscious. "That's going to need a doctor tomorrow to be looked at properly," she said. "The cut might need stitches. The fingers are back in place and will heal if you keep them splinted. Tonight, keep the hand elevated above your heart. Don't clench it." She met his eyes. "You did well." Danny stared at her. Where did you... How do you... Lean on Hector, she said. Don't put weight on that wrist. She stood up. She became aware only then of the ring of men watching her in silence. Hector, his face unreadable. Boyd standing at the edge of the group, his long arms crossed, his expression for the first time something close to open. The younger hands with expressions ranging from astonishment to something that looked, in a few cases, like awe. She looked at none of them for longer than a second. She brushed the dirt from her knees, picked up the remaining cloth scraps, and walked back toward the lumber stack to finish what she'd been doing. There was a long pause in the yard. Then Boyd Emmons said, in his quiet Texan drawl, "Somebody want to tell me where the hell Rhett found this woman?" Rhett was back from the far pasture within the hour. Hector met him at the gate and told him what had happened, and then stood back and watched Rhett's face go through a process that looked a lot like a man reassessing a calculation he'd been sure of. That evening, after Danny had been settled in the bunkhouse and the rest of the hands had gone to dinner, Rhett walked over to the smokehouse. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her boots off, the ankle wrap she'd been wearing redone more carefully than it had been the day before. She had a paperback book open on her knee that she closed without marking the page. "Danny's going to be all right," he said. "I know." He leaned against the doorframe. The evening light was amber behind him, and the smokehouse was dim and cool. "Where did you learn to do that?" She looked at him steadily. "Does it matter?" "To me it does." A pause. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "I spent a long time in a place where there were no doctors. When people got hurt, someone had to handle it." She paused. "I handled it." He waited. She didn't add anything. "Mara," he said slowly, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly, not as a threat." He waited until she met his eyes. "I don't care what you've done. I don't care what you've left behind. What I care about is that people on this ranch are safe. My people. Every one of them." He tilted his head toward the bunkhouse. "And today, by everything I've been told, you protected one of mine. That means something to me." She held his gaze without blinking. "But I need you to understand," he continued, "that there are no lies on this land. If something from your past is going to come through that gate, I need to know about it before it arrives, not after." He paused. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything tonight. I am asking you, eventually, to trust this place with the truth." The silence stretched out between them like the land itself. "I'll try," she said finally. And it wasn't a comfort or a promise exactly. It was just the most honest thing she had to offer, and both of them knew it. He nodded once. He straightened from the doorframe. "Get some rest. The south pasture needs work tomorrow, and I want fresh eyes on the irrigation ditch before the afternoon." He walked back out into the cooling evening. He didn't look back at the smokehouse window, but he was aware of the light within it all the way across the yard. The days accumulated. Heat gave way to slightly less heat. The work continued its relentless rhythm: fence repair, cattle management, irrigation maintenance, the thousand small, unglamorous tasks that keep a working ranch from sliding back into the earth it was built on. Mara folded herself into the rhythm of it with a discipline that was impossible to ignore, even for the hands who had been slowest to warm to her. She learned fast. That was part of it, the way she absorbed instruction and then improved on it, quietly, without announcing the improvement. She also had an eye for structural detail that Rhett found himself relying on more than he'd expected. She was the one who noticed the hairline crack in the water tank before it became a problem, the one who caught that the gray mare's near front shoe was beginning to shift before it could cause damage. She noticed things. She said them plainly and without fanfare, and then she went back to work. But there were other things she couldn't control. The nightmares were not quiet. Rhett heard them twice through the smokehouse wall when he happened to be outside late. A sharp, wrenching sound, quickly suppressed, that stopped as suddenly as it started. Both times he stopped walking. Both times he stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Both times he moved on. He didn't ask. She didn't mention it. And yet the awareness of it settled in him like a stone settling to the bottom of a river, finding its place, becoming part of the landscape. Something had happened to this woman. Something prolonged and deliberate and deeply unkind. And it was not over. He could feel that in the way she always positioned herself with a wall at her back, in the way her eyes tracked movement at the periphery of any space she was in the way she looked at the access road every evening before dark, quickly, as if catching herself doing it, and then looked away. Whatever she was running from, it had not stopped moving. He had spent 9 years building walls around himself with the specific goal of having nothing to protect but what he could see and name and count. 2,000 acres, 6 men, 47 cattle, a smokehouse, a porch that creaked. He was beginning to understand with a kind of dismayed clarity that the inventory was changing. 3 weeks after she'd walked up his road, Rhett found Mara in the pre-dawn dark of the main barn, brushing down the gray mare she'd taken particular care of since her arrival. The horse, who was opinionated and difficult and trusted nobody easily, was standing with her head lowered and her eyes half closed in a state of contentment that Rhett had rarely seen from her. He stopped in the barn doorway. Mara was talking to the horse in a voice too low for him to make out the words. Just the tone, soft, even, unhurried. The horse's ear flicked once, then settled. He stood there longer than he should have, watching. Then he said, "She doesn't let anyone do that." Mara didn't startle. She kept her strokes even and looked up at him with that steady, unreadable gaze. "She lets me." I noticed. He came into the barn leaning against the stall partition. "What's your secret?" Mara was quiet for a moment, working the brush along the mare's neck in long strokes. "You don't force her to trust you," she said. "You just make it safe enough that she decides to." He looked at her across the horse's back. Something in the air of the barn shifted. "Sounds like a philosophy," he said. "Maybe," she said, "or just a fact." He pushed off the partition. He started to turn away, then stopped. "The south fence is done," he said. "The work you did this week, the irrigation fix, the posts, it was good work." She didn't smile, but something in her face settled slightly. "Thank you," she said, not automatically or reflexively, but as though she meant it and had decided it was worth saying. He walked out of the barn. The sky was turning gray at its eastern edge, and somewhere across the pasture, a coyote sent up its thin, wavering call. He stood on the edge of the yard and looked out at his land, and he thought, "This is getting complicated." And then he went inside to start the day. The 4th week began the way the 3rd had ended, with work and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place when people have stopped performing indifference and started practicing something closer to acceptance. Nobody on the Callaway Ranch had formally decided to welcome Mara Ellison. It had happened the way most real things happen, without announcement, in the accumulated small moments of ordinary days. Boyd Emmons, who had said perhaps 30 words to her in 3 weeks, started saving her the better tools from the equipment shed in the mornings without being asked. Hector began including her in the brief tactical conversations he had with Rhett before the day's work assignments were given. Not with fanfare, just by turning to include her, as he might turn to include anyone whose eyes he'd learned to trust. Even Danny Cole, his splinted hand wrapped in healing, had stopped looking at her like a puzzle he was trying to solve and started looking at her like someone he was glad was around. The ranch had a rhythm. She had found her place in it. And Rhett Callaway, who had spent 9 years building a life specifically designed to require nothing from anyone, found himself checking that rhythm each morning the way a man checks a wound he's trying not to favor, carefully, without wanting to, aware that something had changed even if he hadn't decided what to do about it. What he hadn't told anyone, including himself, was that he'd begun to look forward to the mornings, not with any feeling he would have named out loud. But there was a difference now between waking before dawn and having only the work ahead of him, and waking before dawn and knowing that somewhere on his land, someone else was already up, already watching, already at it. That was the honest truth, and it unsettled him. It was in this quiet accumulation that the first nightmare found its way through the walls. He wasn't sleeping. He rarely slept well past 2 in the morning. His body had developed the habit years ago, and he'd stopped fighting it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the ranch's maintenance ledger, penciling through a list of upcoming supply needs, when the sound came from across the yard. It was brief, sharp, and strangled, like something cut off before it could become a scream, and it stopped almost immediately. Then silence. He sat very still. It happened again 3 nights later, and this time it lasted longer. Not a scream, more like someone fighting in the dark, breathless, terrified, losing. And then the silence that followed was the kind that presses back, heavier than what came before it. Rhett set his pen down. He stared at the ledger without seeing it. The smokehouse window was a faint amber square in the dark of the yard, and it stayed lit for a long time after the sound stopped. He didn't go over. He understood, with the instinct of a man who had done his own struggling in the dark, that some battles belong entirely to the person fighting them, and that showing up uninvited is not rescue, it's intrusion. But he sat with it. He let it sit in the room with him, and didn't look away from it the way a man looks away from something that disturbs him, because it's too close to something he recognizes. The next morning, she was at the South Barn before 5, the same as always. She said nothing about the night, he said nothing. But when he handed her the day's assignment list, he had moved the heaviest physical tasks to the other hands and put her on the equipment inventory, which required precision and attention, but not the kind of punishment the body doesn't need on a morning after a bad night. She looked at the list. Then she looked at him, and something in the quality of her look told him she understood exactly what he'd done. "I can handle the fence work," she said. "I know you can," he said, "but the inventory's been sitting undone for 2 weeks and it needs doing. Take the clipboard. Count everything twice." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took the clipboard. "All right," she said quietly. He walked away before either of them could make too much of it. The weeks passed, and the shape of her became clearer to him. Not in any way she intended, but in the way that close proximity and careful attention reveal things. She was knowledgeable about plants, knew which ones could be pressed into service medicinally, and which ones around the pasture were dangerous to cattle. She could read weather with accuracy. She knew how to stretch supplies, and she knew how to prioritize, which is the skill most essential to running any operation and the one most rarely taught. These were not the skills of someone who had simply traveled widely or read extensively. They were the skills of necessity, of someone who had been required to be competent across a wide range of circumstances with limited resources for a long time. She never talked about where she'd learned any of it, but Rhett had stopped expecting her to. He had begun instead to read her history in the margins of what she knew. It was a Tuesday when the deputy came. Rhett saw the vehicle from the north pasture, a dark sedan, not the county sheriff's markings, but close enough that his stomach knew what it was before his eyes confirmed it. He rode back at a pace that was not quite a run, but not far from one. Hector fell in beside him on the road, saying nothing, his face the carefully neutral expression he wore when things were developing in directions he didn't like. The deputy was standing in the main yard when Rhett got there. He was a broad man, maybe 45, with the particular brand of comfortable authority that comes from years of being obeyed in small jurisdictions. His name was Walt Garver, according to the badge, and he had the look of a man who had made the drive out here with a specific intention and wasn't planning on leaving without it. Mara was nowhere in the yard. "Mr. Calloway?" the deputy said, extending a hand. "That's right." Rhett shook it once, briefly. "What can I do for you, Deputy Garver?" "I'm looking for a woman," Garver said. He produced a photograph from the inside pocket of his jacket. A printed image, slightly grainy, but clear enough. A woman, dark-haired, in what looked like a formal photograph. She was dressed differently. Her hair was styled and her expression was composed in the careful way of someone performing composure for a camera, but it was unmistakably Mara Ellison. "Goes by a few names. The one she's in the system under is Claire Ashford, 31 years old. There are outstanding charges, theft, fraud, violation of civil injunction." He looked at Rhett with the measured patience of a man accustomed to being lied to. "She's been flagged as a fugitive as of about 6 weeks ago. Any chance you've seen her?" Rhett looked at the photograph for 2 full seconds. Then he looked at Garver. "What was stolen?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of the case." "Whose injunction?" Garver paused. "That's also part of an active investigation." "Seems like a lot of things you can't talk about," Rhett said, for a man who drove 11 miles off the highway to ask me questions. A flicker moved across Garver's face. Irritation, quickly smoothed. "Mr. Calloway, obstruction of a federal inquiry." "I'm not obstructing anything," Rhett said evenly. "I'm asking you what was stolen and from whom, because in my experience, the answer to those 2 questions tells you most of what you need to know about a situation." He kept his voice level. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description on my property. Now, Is there anything else I can help you with? Garver held his gaze for a moment. Then he tucked the photograph back into his jacket. If this woman makes contact with you, you're legally required to report it. You understand that? He handed over a card. I'll be in the area. Long drive from the highway, Rhett said, taking the card. Shorter than you'd think, Garver said, and walked back to his car. Rhett watched the sedan turn down the access road and disappear into the shimmering distance. He stood very still in the empty yard. Then he turned and looked at the smokehouse. Its door was closed. The window curtain was completely still. He found her inside. She was sitting on the edge of the cot in the cool stone dimness, her hands folded in her lap with the carefully practiced stillness of someone who had heard everything and was now waiting to find out if the ceiling was going to fall. He stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind him. He looked at her. Claire Ashford, he said. She breathed in slowly, then out. That's the name he put me under, she said. Legally. He had it changed. She paused. My name is Mara. That's the name I was born with. Mara Ellison is who I was before I met Damien Blackridge. The name landed in the room like something thrown hard. Tell me, Rhett said. She looked at him for a long moment. The quality of her assessment had changed from what it was in the truck on that first morning. She was no longer measuring where the fence was likely to give. She was deciding whether to open the gate. Sit down, she said, which was the first time she had ever told him to do anything. He sat in the single wooden chair beside the wash basin. The chair complained under his weight, but held. She told him. She told him how she'd met Damien Blackridge at 23, when she was working as a medical aide in a county clinic, and he had walked in as a donor, a wealthy man making a charitable gesture with the specific calculated warmth of someone who knew exactly the impression he was making. She told him about the courtship, which had been swift and consuming and designed, she now understood, like an operation, targeted, efficient, complete. She told him about the marriage at 24, and the first year, which had been fine, or had seemed fine, until the shape of what fine actually meant in Damien Blackridge's household became clear. It hadn't been loud at first. That was the thing people didn't understand, she said, and her voice stayed steady as she said it, though her hands tightened slightly on each other. It started quietly. Small permissions withdrawn, small freedoms rerouted. The phone that was for her safety, but that he could check at any time. The friends who made him uncomfortable. The career she'd been building, which he'd suggested she step back from because he could take care of her, and she didn't need to exhaust herself. Each piece so reasonable in isolation that by the time she understood what they added up to, she was already inside something with walls she couldn't see from the outside. 7 years, she said. I was inside it for 7 years. Rhett said nothing. He held her gaze and he did not look away, even when the description of what those 7 years had contained became specific. He felt a cold, hard thing settle in his chest. Not pity, which would have diminished her, but something closer to fury, contained and still, the way ice contains what is frozen within it. He had the money to make things legal that shouldn't be, she said. He had contacts in the right places. When I tried to leave the first time, she stopped. Started again. He had me brought back, not arrested, brought back, by a private contractor. And then there were legal papers, new documents, a new name filed on records I never signed, and a deputy in 3 different counties who owed him favors. She paused. I don't know if Garver is one of them. I don't know if he believes what he's been told or if he knows exactly what he's doing. Either way, what he said to you, the theft charges, the fraud, those are Damien's documents, not mine. What did you take? Rhett asked. She met his eyes. My medical records, she said. And $3,000 I'd hidden over 4 years in the back of a flour canister. That's what they're calling theft. The corner of her mouth moved, but it wasn't a smile. The injunction is from a civil suit he filed claiming I violated a non-disclosure agreement that I never agreed to and can't even see. The silence held for a moment. He'll come here, Rhett said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He won't send another deputy next time. He'll come himself. She looked at him directly. I'll go. Tonight. I don't want your people to be in the middle of this. You've been... She stopped, and for the first time, something in her voice shifted from steady to something more fragile. You've been decent to me. I'm not going to let that be used against you. You'll go, Rhett said. Yes. Where? She said nothing. You walk out of here tonight, he said quietly. And where do you go? Another road? Another state? How far ahead of him do you think you get before his people find you again? She looked at her hands. Far enough. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. The late afternoon light through the small west window had gone gold, the particular gold that Wyoming evenings produce briefly before the light fails, generous and warm and completely indifferent to whatever was happening beneath it. He could feel the shape of what he was about to do with the specific clarity of a man who recognizes that he's at the edge of something, that the next sentence out of his mouth will change the geography of his life in ways he cannot fully see. He had lived carefully for 9 years. He had chosen the fence over the open country because the open country was where you could lose things. He had chosen this. He thought about the sound through the smokehouse wall in the dark of 2 a.m. He thought about the gray mare with her head down and her eyes half closed while Mara's hands moved over her neck. He thought about Danny Cole on the ground with his hand torn open and the speed with which she'd moved and what it meant that a woman with that kind of competence had been forced to develop it in secret in a house she couldn't leave. You're not going anywhere, he said. She looked up. You're staying here, he said. This is a working ranch. You work here. You are under the protection of this operation and every person in it. He stood up. And when Damian Blackridge comes through that gate, he's going to find out what that means. She stared at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not hope, exactly. Because hope was something she'd learned to be careful with, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been dormant for a very long time and was not entirely sure it was safe to move. Rhett, she said. You don't know what he brings with him. I know what I have, he said. I know my land and my people and what we're capable of when we decide something matters. He looked at her steadily. You matter. To this operation. To this place. He paused and then added with the careful honesty of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. To me. She looked at him for a long moment. He held it. Then she nodded, once, slowly, and that was all. But it was enough. He walked out into the evening yard. He crossed to the bunkhouse and opened the door without knocking, which was not something he usually did. His men's privacy was their own. But this was different. He stepped inside. 6 men looked up. Boyd from the far bunk with a book open across his knees. Hector at the table sharpening a knife. Danny on his bunk with his hand elevated. The others in various states of rest from the long day. Rhett stood at the door. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke the way he always spoke. Level, direct, without theater. A man named Damian Blackridge is going to come to this ranch, he said. He's got money, and he's got legal papers, and he's going to say he has a claim on Mara. He doesn't. She's one of ours. He paused. When he comes, we'll be ready for him. Every man here needs to understand what that could mean before I say another word. He looked around the room. If any man wants to step away from this, he can. No judgment. I'll pay him to the day, full wages, and it won't be spoken of again. Nobody moved. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Boyd Emmons set his book aside and said, in his unhurried Texas drawl, "Tell us what you need." Hector set down his knife. Danny sat up on his bunk. The other hand straightened. Nobody left. Rhett looked at them. All 6, every one of them staying, and something in his chest shifted that he hadn't expected. Not relief. Something older and less comfortable than relief. Something that had to do with knowing, after a long stretch of only counting on himself, that he was not alone in this. All right, he said quietly. Here's what we're going to do. He told them about Garver's visit. He told them what Mara had told him. Not all of it, only what they needed, only what was fair to her. He told them that the access road was the only vehicle approach, that the north and east fences were sound, that they needed to know where every vulnerability was before a man with resources decided to test it. He told them that legal channels would likely be compromised, which meant documentation, everything written, dated, witnessed, was their most important tool. He told them to say nothing outside the property and to trust no vehicles they didn't recognize. The men listened. Then they got to work. Hector rode the perimeter in the last light, checking fence integrity with the particular thoroughness of a man preparing a position. Boyd went over the equipment inventory with Mara, who had returned to the yard with her jaw set and her eyes clear. cataloging what could be repurposed and how. Danny, who couldn't use his hand, was installed at the bunkhouse window with a clear sight line to the access road and specific instructions about what to note if anything appeared on it. The night came in clear and cold. Rhett sat on his porch in the dark, the same way he had sat on it for 9 years, but nothing about it felt the same. The land was familiar. The sky was the same sky. The creaking board under his left boot was the same board it had always been. But somewhere across the yard, a light burned in the smokehouse window, and Rhett Calloway sat in the dark and knew, with the calm certainty of a man who can no longer pretend otherwise, that something had already arrived on this land far more consequential than anything coming up the road. And he intended, with everything this place had given him, and everything it still had in it, to protect it. 3 days passed after Garver's visit without incident, and the waiting was its own kind of violence. The ranch continued its work. Cattle needed moving, equipment needed maintaining. The daily arithmetic of survival didn't pause because something terrible was coming. But everything had acquired a secondary quality, a background hum of alertness that sat beneath every ordinary task, like current beneath still water. Men who had always worked well now worked with an additional precision. Eyes tracked the access road without appearing to. Conversations happened at lower volumes. The whole property had drawn itself in, the way an animal draws itself in before a storm. Mara felt it. She felt it in the way Boyd passed her the morning coffee without comment, but with a deliberateness that meant something. In the way Hector positioned himself during work so that he was always within a short distance of her. In the way the horses were uneasy in their stalls at night, picking up what the humans were putting into the air. She had spent the 3 days doing something none of the men knew about. In the evenings, after work, she had been writing. In a composition notebook she'd found in the equipment shed, the kind meant for tracking supply orders, she had been setting down everything. Names, dates, specific incidents, the civil injunction she'd never agreed to, and the circumstances under which Damien had produced it. The names of the men he'd sent after her the first time she tried to leave. The medical record she'd carried out of the house folded into the lining of her canvas bag, documenting injuries from the years she'd been inside that marriage, documented by a physician who had risked his own license to do it honestly. She wrote it all down in her precise, clear hand, and each night she hid the notebook in a different place, because she understood that documentation was the one weapon that could outlast a fight. On the 4th morning, Rhett found her at the water trough before the others were up. Filling containers with a methodical focus he recognized as something beyond routine. "You're storing water," he said. "The pressure tank is already full," she said without turning. "But if they cut the main line at the junction box, it's exposed on the east side of the property, near the road. You lose pressure to the house and the barn. Any fire they start would be harder to fight." She turned to look at him. "I've been thinking about how he thinks." He studied her. "What does he do first?" "He doesn't do anything first," she said. "He sends someone. He'll want to see the layout. He'll want to know what he's walking into." She paused. "He'll offer money before he offers anything else. He genuinely believes everyone has a number because, in his experience, almost everyone does." She looked back at the containers. When that doesn't work, he removes options. He takes things away, access, resources, legal standing, until what's left doesn't look like a choice anymore. And then he arrives. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "And if none of that works?" Her hand stilled on the container. "Then he burns it," she said simply. "He burned the clinic where my doctor worked. After I left. The man lost everything." She picked up the container and carried it toward the barn without another word. Rhett stood in the early light and let the specific cold fact of that settle into him. Then he went inside and made a phone call to his attorney in Cody. Then another to the county sheriff. Not to report anything yet, but to establish a record of contact. Paper trail first. That was what she'd said, and she was right. He was on the porch with the second call still in his hand when the vehicles appeared at the end of the access road. There were 3 of them. 2 black SUVs flanking a silver sedan that moved with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle carrying someone who has never in his adult life had to hurry for anything. They came up the road at a measured pace and stopped in the main yard with a choreography that made clear this was not the first time these men had arrived somewhere as a coordinated unit. The men who stepped out of the SUVs were not wearing uniforms, but they had the body language of people accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any given space. 4 of them, 2 from each vehicle. They fanned out without being told, and they did it in a way that covered the yard's angles, and every one of Rhett's ranch hands who was in that yard understood immediately what they were looking at. The man who stepped out of the silver sedan last did so with the ease of someone stepping out of a car at a restaurant he owned. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical fitness that money makes easy, and the kind of face that had probably been conventionally handsome once and was now simply authoritative. The jaw too deliberate, the eyes a particular shade of pale gray that managed to look simultaneously sharp and empty. He wore a jacket that cost more than any single piece of equipment on the ranch, and he looked around the yard with the calm, assessing gaze of a man calculating what things are worth. Damian Blackridge. Rhett came down from the porch. He didn't walk fast. He crossed the yard at his ordinary pace, the pace of a man on his own land who has nowhere to be except where he's going. "Mr. Calloway," Blackridge said, extending his hand with a warmth that was deployed rather than felt. "I apologize for arriving without advance notice. My name is Damian Blackridge. I believe we have a mutual interest to discuss." Rhett shook the hand briefly. "Is that right?" "I think so." Blackridge looked around the yard with that measured gaze. "This is a fine operation. I've heard good things about the Calloway Ranch, the longevity of it, the way it's been run. I have a great deal of respect for that kind of legacy." He looked back at Rhett. "I'll be direct. There's a woman here. I believe she came to you under false pretenses, and I believe you may not be fully aware of the legal situation surrounding her. I'm not here to make trouble for you or your operation. I'm here to resolve a private family matter." "Family," Rhett said. "My wife," Blackridge said. His voice carried the precise weight of a man practicing a word he's used many times. "I understand she may have told you a different version of events. He paused, choosing something from a prepared selection. "She's been under a great deal of strain. I'm genuinely concerned for her welfare." "Then you should have taken better care of her," Rhett said. A small shift in Blackridge's expression. Not anger exactly, but something adjusting behind the warmth. He smiled. "I understand. She's persuasive. She makes an impression." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope. "I want to make this simple for everyone involved. Inside that envelope is a check for $150,000 made out to the Calloway Ranch operation, which I understand has some outstanding equipment loan obligations. Consider it a contribution, a gesture of appreciation for your hospitality and for releasing her into my care." The word care landed the way he intended it to, wrapped in something that sounded like concern. Rhett looked at the envelope. He didn't take it. "Take it back," he said. Blackridge's smile held. "Mr. Calloway." "Take it back and put it away," Rhett said, his voice exactly as level as before. "And then I'm going to tell you one time what the situation is here." Something behind Blackridge's eyes shifted, just slightly, the calculation adjusting. "She works here," Rhett said. "She's been here for just over a month. She's earned her place. She's under the protection of this ranch and every person on it." He held Blackridge's gaze without difficulty. "Your papers don't mean anything on this property. Your check doesn't mean anything. And the men you brought with you—" He let his eyes move briefly to the 4 figures stationed around the yard, and Blackridge noticed what Rhett had done, which was position all 6 of his own people at points that covered every one of those men without having appeared to. "They're going to get back in those vehicles, and you're going to go back to wherever it is you came from. That's the only business we're going to do today." Blackridge looked at him for a long moment. The warmth had been set aside. What was underneath it was not rage. It was colder than rage. It was the face of a man who has decided that a problem requires a different kind of solution. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "You're making a significant mistake, and I'm trying to give you the opportunity to avoid it." "I've made mistakes before," Rhett said. "This isn't one." The silence in the yard was absolute. Even the horses had gone still. Then the door of the smokehouse opened. Mara walked out into the yard. She walked the way she'd been walking since the first morning, straight, unhurried, that slight hitch in her gait that she absorbed without drama. She came to a stop on the open ground between Rhett and Blackridge, and she stood there in the full flat light of the Wyoming morning, and she looked at the man who had held her life in his hands for 7 years. Damian Blackridge looked at her, and for just a fraction of a second, so brief that only someone watching for it would have caught it, Something moved across his face that was not calculated at all. Raw and fast and immediately covered, but there, the specific expression of a man confronting something he thought he owned that is standing upright on its own. "Mara," he said. The warmth was back, adjusted now, softer. "You look tired. Let me take you home." "I am home," she said. Her voice was steady. It was steadier than Rhett had ever heard it. Not the controlled steadiness of someone managing fear, but the natural steadiness of someone who has reached the far side of something and is standing on solid ground for the first time in a very long time. "This isn't what you think it is," Blackridge said. He was talking to her, but his eyes moved briefly to the men around the yard, measuring, recalculating. "These people don't know you. Whatever you've told them—" "I told them the truth," she said. "Something you never let me do." She looked at him directly, and she did not look away. "I'm not coming back. I'm not going to belong to you again. Not in a document, not in a courthouse, not in any version of this. It's over." Blackridge was quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rhett. "The offer stands," he said, "until it doesn't." He picked up the envelope from where he'd rested it against the hood of the sedan. He put it back in his jacket. He looked around the yard one more time with the expression of a man making a very detailed mental note of everything he sees. Then he got back in the silver sedan, and the four men folded back into the SUVs, and the three vehicles turned and went back down the access road the way they'd come. The ranch exhaled. Boyd let out a long, slow breath. Danny said something low under his breath that was not printable. Hector watched the vehicles until they were a diminishing shape in the long distance, and his expression was the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that what just left is not what's done. Rhett turned to Mara. She was still standing in the middle of the yard, and some of the steadiness had gone out of her stance now that the moment was over. She was trembling faintly, barely visible, the kind of shaking that happens when the body releases what it's been holding. "You didn't have to come out," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her. "How are you?" She took a careful breath. "Ask me in an hour," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough?" He looked at Hector. "Double the watch on the road tonight, rotating. Nobody rides alone." Hector nodded once, already moving. That night, Rhett sat with his attorney on the phone for an hour, detailing everything. He described Garver's visit. He described Blackridge's arrival, the envelope, the specific words exchanged. He described Mara's circumstances as she'd told them to him. By the end of the call, two things were in motion: an emergency petition for a protective order through the county court, and a request to a federal contact the attorney maintained, someone who had been building a financial fraud case against Blackridge's business interests for 2 years and had been looking for a human witness who had been inside the man's life. That last piece was the attorney's idea. Rhett relayed it to Mara over coffee at the kitchen table, the first time she had been inside the main house. She sat across from him with both hands around the mug and listened. "They want your testimony," he said. "Your notebook, your medical records, everything you've been documenting, if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. "That would put me in a federal proceeding." "It would put him in one," Rhett said. "You'd be a witness, protected." She looked at her coffee, then at him. "He'll know I'm the one who opened the door." "He already knows," Rhett said. "He just doesn't know the door's already open." She thought about that. Then she nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Rhett called the attorney back. By morning, they had the beginning of what they needed. What they did not have was time. Garver came back 2 days later, and this time he didn't come alone. He had a county deputy with him, younger, uncomfortable, clearly following instructions he hadn't written, and a set of papers that he delivered to Rhett on the porch with the satisfaction of a man who has found a leverage point. The papers were a civil order, issued the previous afternoon by a circuit court judge in a county 300 miles away, a judge whose name the attorney would later describe, with barely contained fury, as someone who had received significant financial contributions from Blackridge's foundation the previous year. The order instructed Rhett to produce Mara Ellison, also known as Claire Ashford, for a court appearance within 48 hours or face contempt charges. 48 hours, Garver said, with the careful patience of a man delivering terms. Rhett took the papers. He read them. He handed them to Mara, who was standing beside him on the porch, and read them with a stillness that cost her something. "You'll have our attorney's response before close of business," Rhett said to Garver. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be clear about what contempt of a civil court order." "And I want to be clear," Rhett said quietly, with the specific weight of a man who has made his decision and is simply informing the air around him of the fact that this woman is not going anywhere on the basis of a document produced by a judge who has taken money from the man who wants her returned. I want you to hear that, and I want you to think very carefully about which side of the situation you're standing on when it's done." He held Garver's eyes. "Because it's going to be done, and people are going to know who stood where." Something shifted in Garver's face, not the irritation from before. Something more uncomfortable, something that looked, briefly, like uncertainty. The young deputy beside him looked at the ground. Garver said nothing more. He walked back to his car. The young deputy followed, but he walked slowly, and he didn't look satisfied. The attorney filed a challenge to the order within 3 hours, citing the judge's financial entanglements and requesting a federal review. It bought them time, but how much time was not something anyone could guarantee. Rhett called a meeting that evening. All 6 hands, Mara and himself, in the main barn, where the horses provided their uncomplicated company and the stone walls held the sound in. He told them exactly where things stood. He did not soften it. He told them the order had been filed, that the challenge was in motion, that they had bought time but not infinite time, and that Blackridge was not the kind of man who waited for legal processes when he had other tools available. "He's going to move," Rhett said. "Not legally. Whatever he does next is going to be something he can't file paperwork for." He looked at each of them. "I need to know if this ranch is prepared." Nobody hesitated. They spent the next 6 hours mapping the property in a way Rhett had never thought of it before. Not as a working ranch, but as a position. The north and east fences had already been verified sound. The water was stored. The equipment shed was inventoried. The access road had one approach. The ridge to the west offered sight lines in 2 directions. The main barn could serve as a secondary position if the house became exposed. It was Mara who identified the weak point. She stood in the barn and looked at the layout drawn roughly on the back of a supply order and said, with the calm of someone accustomed to thinking like someone who wants to cause harm, "He won't come up the road the second time. He'll come over the north ridge on foot in the dark, and he'll have people at the access road as a diversion." She tapped the north fence line on the drawing. "This is where he comes in." Rhett looked at her. "You sound certain." "I've seen him plan," she said. "He thinks in 2 moves, always. The thing you're watching for is never the thing he actually does." She looked up. "The thing he actually does comes from behind." The barn was quiet. "Then that's where we'll be," Rhett said. Hector put 2 men on the north ridge before it was fully dark, with clear instructions and a radio. Boyd took the access road approach with Danny, whose hand had healed enough that he could manage a radio of his own. Rhett took the main house position and the yard. Mara, after a conversation that Rhett had attempted to have differently and she had refused, stayed in the main house, not because she was hidden, but because she was the person with the medical training and the main house had the supplies. She made that argument so rationally and with such complete refusal to be moved that he had accepted it, which was a new experience for him and not an entirely unwelcome one. They waited. The night came in cold and moonlit, the kind of high Wyoming dark that makes everything sharp-edged and cast in silver. The ranch was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of cattle in the far pasture and the wind moving through the grass. To anyone passing on the highway 11 miles away, it was simply a dark building on dark land. At 11:14, Hector's voice came over the radio. Low, controlled, exact. "North Ridge, 3 men, coming down on foot." At the same moment, headlights appeared at the end of the access road. 1 vehicle, slow. "Boyd," Rhett said quietly into the radio, "you've got a vehicle on the road." "I see it," Boyd said, "sitting at the gate, not coming through." "Diversion," Mara said from the doorway of the main house behind him. She had the radio tuned and the supply kit open beside her. "The ones on the ridge are the real move." Rhett was already moving to the north side of the yard. What happened in the next 47 minutes would be described later in various legal documents as an attempted forced entry on private property by armed individuals. That description was accurate as far as it went. What it did not capture was the noise of it, the shout from the ridge as Hector's men confronted the three coming down, the crash of the gate when the vehicle at the access road finally accelerated through it, the sound of the yard suddenly full of movement and weight, and the very specific kind of chaos that arrives when a plan meets a position it didn't fully account for. Blackridge's men were professionals. They moved well, communicated in short signals, and covered each other with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. But they had expected a ranch full of sleeping civilians, and what they had instead was 6 men who had spent 3 days preparing a position, who knew every angle of the ground they were standing on, and who were fighting for something specific. The first gunshots came from the ridge, warning shots, Hector's men establishing position and forcing the 3 intruders to stop and reassess. The vehicle that had broken through the gate made it halfway up the access road before Boyd put a spike strip across the road, an item the attorney had quietly suggested acquiring, which Boyd had done without comment, and it stopped hard, the front end going down with a sound like a mechanical sigh. The yard itself became the most contested ground. 2 of Blackridge's men had made it to the edge of the main yard before the full weight of what they'd walked into became apparent. Rhett met them in the open, and the conversation was brief and brutal and physical in the way that things become when men who are serious about what they're doing are in the same space. And when it was done, both men were on the ground, and Rhett had a split lip and a pain in his ribs that would keep him awake for 2 weeks. Through all of it, from the doorway of the house, Mara watched. Her hand was tight around the doorframe. She was not hiding. She was there, present, accounting for every person she could see, already calculating what she would need if someone came out of this bleeding. Then Garver's vehicle came up the road. He had a radio too, and somewhere in the preceding hour he had been monitoring communications he was not supposed to have access to. He knew what was happening, and when he drove onto the ranch and stepped out into the chaos of the yard, into the noise and the aftermath of it, he looked at Blackridge's 2 men on the ground, and at Rhett standing over them with blood on his face, and at the 3 men Hector was bringing down from the ridge with their hands behind their heads, and something in Garver's face did the thing that Rhett had been watching for. It broke. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a man's certainty breaks when he has been standing on the wrong side of a line long enough to finally see it for what it is. He reached for his radio. He called it in, not to Blackridge's people, to the county dispatch. He reported an armed incursion on private property. He gave the address. He gave the names of the men on the ground. He stood in the yard with his badge and his radio, and he chose, in the full and irreversible way that choosing goes, which side of the line he was standing on. A shot cracked from the direction of the access road. Garver went down. Not dead. The shot had taken him in the left shoulder, and he was down hard and cursing, which meant he was alive. Rhett was moving toward him before the sound of the shot had finished echoing. The man who had fired it was Damian Blackridge, who had come up the road on foot behind his own vehicle and had been standing at the edge of the property and had watched his deputy make his radio call and had made a decision about what that meant and had acted on it with the specific casual brutality of a man for whom other people's bodies have always been a means to an end. He was still holding the gun. He looked across the yard at Mara, standing in the doorway of the house, and he started walking toward her. "You belong to me," he said. His voice was completely calm. That was the most frightening thing about it. The total absence of heat. Just the flat, absolute certainty of a man who has never accepted a world in which things he has decided to own can simply decide to stop being his. "You have always belonged to me, and I am going to take you out of here, and everyone who stood in my way is going to spend the next 10 years in a courtroom." He kept walking. "Come out here." Mara did not move from the doorway. Her face was steady. Her eyes were on him. "No," she said. Blackridge raised the gun. Rhett's shot was a single, clean sound in the cold Wyoming night. Damian Blackridge stopped walking. The gun fell from his hand. He stood for one moment in the middle of the yard with his pale eyes registering something that might have been surprise, and then he went down into the Wyoming dirt, and he did not get up. The silence that followed was the deepest kind, the kind that comes after something large has ended. The horses were quiet. The wind had died. The distant cattle made no sound. The whole flat, vast, indifferent land held itself still. Rhett stood in the yard with the rifle at his side. He was breathing hard, His ribs hurt and his lip was bleeding, and he was standing in the dark on his own land at the end of something he had not chosen but had not looked away from, and he felt the specific weight of what he'd done settle into him. Not guilt, but gravity. The serious, sober weight of a man who has fired a gun at another human being and knows exactly why and will carry the knowledge of it for the rest of his life. He turned toward the house. Mara had come out onto the porch. She was standing at the top of the steps, and she was looking at him, and there was blood on the sleeve of her shirt. A graze, he would discover, from a shot fired in the confusion near the ridge, which she had not mentioned during any of the preceding minutes, because there were other priorities, and she was the kind of person who understood what a priority was. He crossed the yard. He went up the porch steps. He stood in front of her. She was holding her arm against her body, her jaw set, her eyes very dark and very clear. "You're hit," he said. "It's not bad," she said. "Let me see." She turned her arm so he could see the graze along her upper arm. Clean, shallow, already clotting. She was right. It was not bad. But his hand closed around her forearm with a steadiness that was holding something else in it, something that had been building since the morning on the road a month ago. And she felt it, and she didn't pull away. "It's over," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. She looked at him the way someone looks when they are standing somewhere they thought they might never get to stand, aware of the ground under their feet, aware of the air, aware of themselves as a living person in a specific place at a specific moment, and feeling the full weight of what it means that they are still here. "It's over," she said. Behind them, Hector was already on the radio. Boyd was moving through the yard. In the distance, the first faint sound of sirens was beginning its long approach up the highway, crossing the dark and the miles, coming in. The sirens arrived in 3 waves. First, the county sheriff. 2 vehicles coming fast up the access road, light bars cutting the dark into frantic blue and red. Then an ambulance, summoned by Hector before the last gunshot had stopped echoing. Then, 40 minutes later, a second ambulance and 2 federal vehicles that moved with the particular purposeful quiet of agencies that have been waiting for an excuse to arrive and have finally been given one. Rhett met the sheriff at the gate. His name was Earl Dunmore, a man in his late 50s who had known the Callaway Ranch the way any county sheriff knows the major operations in his territory, which is to say, by reputation and tax record, and the occasional fence dispute, but not intimately. He stepped out of his vehicle and looked at the yard, at the men on the ground, at Blackridge's body, at the spike-stripped SUV halfway up the access road, at the 6 ranch hands standing in various states of composed alertness around the perimeter. And he took his hat off and ran a hand over his head in the gesture of a man recalibrating his expectations for the evening. "Rhett Callaway," he said. "Earl," Rhett said. "You want to tell me what happened here?" "I want to tell you exactly what happened here," Rhett said. "Every piece of it. But first I need your ambulance people to look at Deputy Garver. He took a round in the shoulder and he's been down for about 12 minutes. Dunmore's eyebrows went up. "Garver's here?" "He's the one who called it in to your dispatch," Rhett said, "before Blackridge shot him." There was a pause while Dunmore processed the specific implication of that sentence. Then he turned and signaled his people toward the far side of the yard, where Garver was sitting against the fence post with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his face the gray-white of a man in significant pain who is nonetheless staying conscious on principle. The next 2 hours were a controlled version of chaos, the kind that has paperwork at the center of it. Statements were taken. The yard was photographed. Blackridge's men, all of whom had survived the night with varying degrees of injury, were zip-tied and sat against the barn wall waiting for transport. The federal agents who arrived in the second wave moved through the scene with a focused efficiency that told Rhett they had been building toward something like this for a long time, and were now engaged in the careful work of confirming what they already knew. Mara sat on the porch steps with a bandage on her arm that she'd applied herself before the ambulance had even turned off its engine, watching everything with the stillness of someone who has learned that the moments after violence are almost more important than the violence itself. That this is when things get decided, when the story of what happened gets established, and that the version established in these first hours is the version that tends to persist. She was approached by one of the federal agents, a woman, which Rhett noted and which he suspected was not accidental, who introduced herself quietly and sat down on the steps beside Mara with a notepad and a manner that was professional without being cold. They talked for a long time. Rhett could not hear what was said, but he watched Mara's face from across the yard as she talked, and what he saw was not a woman being interrogated. It was a woman delivering a testimony she had been preparing in one form or another for years. At some point, Mara went inside and came back with the composition notebook. She handed it to the federal agent, who received it with both hands, which Rhett thought was exactly the right way to receive something like that. He was giving his own statement to Dunmore when the older man paused and said, with the directness of someone who has decided to ask something outside the official transcript, "You knew what you were walking into, Rhett, when you kept her here." "I knew enough," Rhett said. "That's a considerable amount of risk for someone you'd known a month." Rhett looked at him. "How long does it take to know whether someone deserves protecting?" Dunmore looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notepad and didn't ask anything further on that subject. Garver was taken by ambulance before midnight. He had lost meaningful blood from the shoulder wound, but the round had gone through cleanly, and the paramedic who assessed him used the word fortunate twice, which, under the circumstances, was accurate in more ways than one. As they loaded him, he asked one of Dunmore's deputies to make sure the Callaway Ranch got a copy of the radio call he'd made, the timestamp, the exact words, all of it. The deputy looked uncertain. Garver, flat on the stretcher with an IV in his arm and his badge still on his chest, said, "Just make sure they get it," and then said nothing else until the ambulance doors closed. It was close to 2 a.m. when the last official vehicle left the property. The spike strip had been recovered. Blackridge's men were in county transport. The federal agents had loaded their evidence into their vehicles with the careful, documented thoroughness of people who had no intention of seeing this case fall apart on a procedural technicality. Dunmore was the last to go. He stood at the gate with Rhett in the cold and the quiet and looked at the ranch for a long moment. "Self-defense is going to be straightforward," he said. The man shot a law enforcement officer and was advancing on a civilian with a drawn weapon. There are 8 witnesses and a body of evidence the size of a small library. He put his hat on. "I've been in this county for 22 years, Rhett. I want you to know I didn't know about Garver. Whatever he was doing for Blackridge, I didn't know." "I believe you," Rhett said. "I should have known," Dunmore said quietly. "Maybe," Rhett said, "but you know now. That's what you do with it." Dunmore shook his hand and drove back down the road into the dark. Rhett stood at the gate for a while after the taillights disappeared. The land was very quiet. The stars overhead were the particular stars of high Wyoming altitude, not the soft scattered light of lower elevations, but hard and distinct, and so numerous they seemed impractical. He stood in that cold and that quiet, and he felt the full weight of the night settling through him, layer by layer, and he let it. When he went back across the yard, he found Mara still on the porch. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, and her arms wrapped around them, looking out at the land the way someone looks at something they are not entirely sure is real. The bandage on her arm was clean. Her face in the porch light was exhausted and very still and more open than he had seen it yet. He sat down beside her on the step. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are still in the process of understanding what it means. "The agent wants me to come to Denver in 2 weeks, Mara said finally. "Full testimony. The financial fraud case they've been building. Apparently Blackridge's holdings are substantial, and the investigation has been looking for a witness with direct access to his private operations for over a year." "You were inside his life for 7 years, Rhett said. "I know things I didn't even know I knew," she said. "About money that moved through accounts in my name that I never signed. About properties. About men who came to the house that I was told were business associates." She paused. "I've been sitting here trying to remember everything, and the more I pull on it, the more there is." "Your attorney will help you organize it," Rhett said. "My attorney can make an introduction, someone with federal case experience, if you want." She turned to look at him. "You're already thinking about next steps." "Someone has to," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile he'd seen from her, and it was brief, but it was there. Then it faded, and she looked back out at the land. "Rhett, what happens now? To the ranch? To your people? You could have stayed out of it, any of this, from the very first morning." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. He had been a man of careful words for a long time, not because he was inarticulate, but because he had learned that most of what people say is the outer layer of what they mean, and he had stopped seeing the point of the outer layer. Because you deserved better, he said. Because what was done to you was wrong. Because this is my land, and I decide what it stands for. He paused. And because I looked at you on that road and I saw someone who was still standing. After everything that had tried to put her down, she was still standing. He looked at her directly. I've spent 9 years not seeing anything that made me want to stand up for it. You were the first thing in a long time that did. The night held them in its quiet. Mara looked at him for a long moment. The same quality of gaze she'd turned on him in the truck on the first morning, but changed now. The measurement replaced by something that had reached a conclusion and was resting in it. She didn't say anything in response to what he'd said. She didn't need to. She leaned slightly, just slightly, so that her shoulder was against his, and she looked back out at the land, and he didn't move away. They sat like that until the sky began to change at its eastern edge. The days that followed were not easy, but they were navigable, which was more than could have been said for any day in the preceding month. The ranch sustained itself, the way ranches do, because the work doesn't pause for the drama of the people doing it. Cattle needed water, fences needed walking. The gray mare had pulled a shoe and needed the farrier. All of this happened in the first 48 hours after the night of Blackridge's arrival, and the fact that it did, the fact that the ordinary machinery of the place kept turning, was its own kind of comfort. The legal confirmation came in stages. First, a call from Rhett's attorney confirming that the self-defense finding was being expedited, given the volume of witness testimony and the presence of federal observers during the scene documentation. Then a formal letter from the federal investigation team, addressed to Mara directly, at the Callaway Ranch, which was the first piece of official correspondence she had ever received at an address that was not Blackridge's, informing her that the civil orders against her had been suspended pending investigation and that her legal name, Mara Ellison, had been restored in the federal record. She read that letter at the kitchen table. Rhett brought her coffee without being asked and sat down across from her, and he watched her read it twice, the second time very slowly, and he saw the moment it arrived. The thing she'd been carrying letting go of her, or some significant piece of it. The tension across her shoulders releasing in a way he hadn't realized had been constant until it wasn't. She set the letter down. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. "My name," she said quietly. "Your name," he said. She looked at the letter for another moment, then she looked at him. Something in her eyes was bright in a way that was different from the night on the porch. Not the brightness of relief or exhaustion or the aftermath of fear, but something simpler and older. The brightness of a person who has been given back something they thought was gone. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I've been thinking about where to go next," she said. "The federal case will take months. The testimony in Denver is 2 weeks out. After that," she paused. "I've been thinking about that. The after." He was careful to keep his face neutral, which cost him something. "What have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "that I don't know what I want yet. I know what I don't want. I don't want to hide. I don't want to be somewhere because I have no options." She met his eyes. "But I also know that this is the first place I've been in 7 years where I felt safe enough to sleep the whole night through. And that started happening." She paused, calculating, and he realized she was being precise. 3 weeks ago. Before any of this, just from being here. He said nothing. He waited. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I want to make that clear. I'm not asking you to make room or change anything. I'm telling you where I am. Because you asked me once to eventually trust this place with the truth, and I think this is part of the truth." Rhett looked at her across the kitchen table of the house where he'd eaten alone for 9 years, in the morning light that was coming through the window over the sink, the same way it always had, falling on the same floor and the same walls, and illuminating now a face that had not been there before, and that the room seemed, in his perhaps subjective assessment, to have made room for without difficulty. "This place isn't going anywhere," he said, "and neither am I." He picked up his coffee. "The smokehouse is yours for as long as you want it. The work is yours. The rest of it?" He paused, and the pausing was its own kind of answer. "We'll figure out as we go." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, the same way she'd nodded on the night he'd told her she wasn't leaving, not as agreement to a decision someone else had made, but as the considered, deliberate assent of someone making a choice entirely their own. "All right," she said. It was the same word she'd said on that first morning when he'd handed her the assignment list and redirected her away from the heavy work. The same word, but with a different weight in it now. Settled, decided, pointing in a direction. Boyd Emmons, who heard none of this conversation and would not have referenced it if he had, nevertheless appeared in the yard that morning with 2 posts and a replacement rail for a section of fence near the smokehouse that he had apparently decided, entirely on his own initiative, needed upgrading. He worked on it through the middle of the day with the unhurried thoroughness that was his signature. And when it was done right, solid, squared, the best materials from the stack. When Mara walked past in the afternoon and stopped to look at it, he was already packing his tools. "Good work," she said. "Seemed worth doing properly," he said, and walked back toward the barn. Hector, who expressed affection primarily through operational decisions, quietly redistributed the watch schedule so that Mara's working hours aligned with the parts of the property closest to people rather than isolated sections. A change so subtle it could have been coincidence, and was not. Danny Cole, whose hand was healing well, had taken to asking her questions about medical procedures with the transparent enthusiasm of someone who has discovered a new subject and is not entirely sure he's allowed to be interested in it. She answered his questions patiently and in detail, and he wrote things down in a small notebook he carried in his shirt pocket, and nobody commented on it. The ranch was changing, not in any single thing, but in the aggregate of all the small things. The way a place changes when the people in it have been through something together and have come out on the same side. On the 5th day after the confrontation, Rhett drove into town for supplies and came back with, among the usual provisions, a small stack of medical reference books he'd ordered from the bookstore on the main street. He left them on the kitchen table without comment. Mara found them when she came in for dinner, and she stood looking at them for a moment before she picked up the top one and turned it over to read the back. "You didn't have to do this," she said when he came through from the back. "The ranch's first aid capacity has been substandard for years," he said, keeping his back to her while he hung up his jacket. "Seems like an operational improvement." She was quiet. He turned around. She was looking at him with the small, private expression that was the closest she came to showing what was happening inside her. Not a smile exactly, but the shape of one, held slightly back. "An operational improvement," she said. "That's what it is," he said. "All right," she said for the 3rd time, and took the book to the porch to read. The news of what had happened at the Callaway Ranch moved through the valley the way news moves in places where people live close to the land and far from each other. Slowly, then all at once. The story was roughly accurate in its outlines and considerably embellished in its details, which is also typical. What mattered was the substance of it, that a man with significant money and reach had come to the valley and been stopped, that a woman who had been treated as property had walked out onto a porch in front of him and said no and meant it, that the ranch and the people in it had held. 3 neighboring ranchers made the drive over in the week following. All of them came with some official purpose: a borrowed piece of equipment, a question about grazing rights, a load of lumber that the Callaways had apparently owed someone for months, which Rhett had no memory of. And all of them, each in his own way, made it clear by the time they left that they had taken a position, that whatever came next for the Callaway Ranch would not go unanswered by the people around it. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody had to. Walt Garver was released from the county hospital on day 4 with his shoulder bandaged and his future with the federal deputy service under a review that everyone involved understood was going to go badly for him. His radio call, time-stamped, recorded, made before Blackridge's bullet hit him, had been introduced into the federal record as evidence of the corruption surrounding Blackridge's network. The lawyers were going to spend considerable time with Walt Garver's career history. He had not, by any assessment, been a good man in his dealings with Blackridge. But the call he'd made from the yard of the Callaway Ranch in the worst moment was a true thing, and the investigation had noted it. And what that amounted to in the end was between Garver and the federal prosecutor and the facts of what he'd done over the years. Rhett was not the one to decide any of that. He had said what he'd said at the gate, and he believed it, and he left it there. On the day the last of the legal paperwork arrived, confirming the suspension of all charges against Mara Ellison. Not the final resolution, which would take months, but the first clear official signal that the architecture of Lies Blackridge had built around her was beginning to come down. Rhett found her in the barn with the gray mare in the early evening. The horse had her head on Mara's shoulder. Mara was standing very still, her arm around the animal's neck, her face turned slightly away. She wasn't crying, but she was very still in the way a person is still when they are holding something enormous inside them, when the container is almost too small for what it's asked to hold. He stopped in the barn entrance. He didn't move. She stayed that way for a long time. The mare stayed with her, unmoving, present in the way animals are present. Uncomplicated, warm, without agenda. Offering the specific comfort of something that exists entirely in the moment it's in and asks nothing of the past or the future. Eventually, Mara's shoulders settled. She moved her hand slowly along the horse's neck. She said something too quiet for Rhett to hear, and the mare's ear flicked once. Then she looked up and saw him in the doorway. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the porch 3 nights ago, directly, without the calculation she'd carried in her eyes on the road. She looked at him like someone who has decided, finally, that being seen is not the same as being vulnerable. He came into the barn. He stood beside the mare. He put his hand on the horse's nose, and the mare permitted it, which she would not have done 6 weeks ago. "The papers came," he said. "I know," she said. "Your attorney called." He nodded. "It's not finished, but it started." "It started," she agreed. The barn was warm with the body heat of horses and the specific close smell of hay and leather and the old wood of the stalls. Outside, the sun was going down over the Bighorn foothills, turning the sky the colors it turned every evening over this particular piece of ground, orange giving way to violet, giving way to the deep, steady blue of altitude. Through the barn door, the ranch was visible in its evening state. The bunkhouse with its window lit, the main house with its porch light on, the corrals quiet, and the fence line running in both directions as far as the eye could follow. "I used to try to imagine what a place like this would feel like," Mara said. She was looking out through the barn door at the same view he was. "When I was inside that house, I used to think about open land, space, room to hear yourself." She paused. "I couldn't picture it clearly enough to hold on to. It kept slipping." He was quiet. "It doesn't slip anymore," she said. He looked at her profile in the barn light. 9 years he had tended this place like a wound he was trying to close. 9 years of work as its own reward and silence as its own company, and the land as everything it needed to be because he had decided that was enough. He had been for 9 years a man surviving himself. He had been good at it. He had built something real in the surviving. But survival and living are not the same thing, and standing in that barn in the last of the evening light, he knew the difference in a way he hadn't let himself know it in a very long time. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She saw it in his face. Whatever was there, whatever the years of keeping people at a careful distance had compressed into something hard and dense and quiet, that was now, simply and without performance, present in his expression. She looked at him for a long time. Then she took one step toward him, and he didn't move back. And the space between them closed, in the way spaces close when two people who have been circling something decide at the same moment that the circling is done. He put his hand on the side of her face, carefully, the way he touched things he intended to keep. Outside, the last of the light left the sky, and the stars came in over Wyoming, and the ranch settled into the quiet of evening, and the day ended. The federal case took 11 months. Rhett had been warned by his attorney that it would take longer, and it did take longer than any single month suggested it would, but shorter than the worst estimate, which was, his attorney said, about as well as these things ever went. 11 months of depositions and document reviews and phone calls that came at inconvenient hours and required Mara to sit at the kitchen table with a notepad and her precise, unsparing memory and account for things she would have preferred to leave behind her. 11 months of the legal system doing what the legal system does, which is move slowly and grind thoroughly and produce, eventually, something that resembles justice without being quite the same shape as the thing that was taken. Mara went to Denver 4 times. The first trip, Rhett drove her himself, an 8-hour round trip that he made without being asked, and that she did not argue with, which told him something. She sat in the passenger seat of his truck the way she'd sat on that first morning, bag on the floor between her feet, looking straight ahead through the windshield. But everything else was different. She talked. Not constantly. She was still Mara, still economical with words in the way that people are when they've learned that words have weight and should be spent accordingly. But she talked, and what she said was not performance. It was the easy, ordinary conversation of someone who has decided that another person's company is something they want, rather than something they're calculating the cost of. She told him about her mother, who had died when Mara was 17, and who had been, by her description, a woman of extraordinary patience and very little tolerance for dishonesty. She told him about the medical aid work she'd done before Blackridge, 3 years at a county clinic in the eastern part of the state, work she'd been genuinely good at and genuinely wanted, and that she had walked away from because a man with pale gray eyes and a tailored jacket had made staying seem more important. She told him about the moment, somewhere in the 3rd year of the marriage, when she had understood fully and without any remaining ambiguity what she had walked into, and the moment, somewhere in the 5th year, when she had stopped waiting to be saved and started learning everything she could that might eventually save herself. "That's when I started listening differently," she said, somewhere in the stretch of highway between the Wyoming border and the Denver suburbs. "He had meetings in the house. He'd have people come. He thought I wasn't paying attention." She looked out the window at the passing country. "I was paying very close attention." "The Notebook," Rhett said. "A lot more than The Notebook," she said quietly. When they reached Denver, he walked her to the building entrance and she went up alone, which was what she wanted, because the testimony was hers, and she intended to deliver it as hers, not escorted, not supported, not softened by the proximity of someone who would absorb some of the weight. She was in there for 4 hours. He sat in the truck in the parking structure and read a 2-month-old copy of a ranching trade magazine he found under the seat and thought about irrigation systems with the focused inattention of a man trying not to think about something else. When she came out, she walked across the parking structure with her chin level and her steps even, and she got in the truck and closed the door and said, "Let's go home." He started the truck. "How was it?" "Hard," she said. "Necessary." She looked at her hands for a moment. "The prosecutor, she's good. She knows what she's doing." She paused. She said Damien had been doing this for over 20 years, that I'm the 3rd woman he married this way. The other 2, she stopped. "They didn't make it out the way I did." The truck was quiet for a moment. "They're okay," Mara said quickly, reading his expression. "They're alive. But the cases were settled privately, sealed. He bought their silence because they didn't have..." She paused, choosing the word with care. "Because they didn't have what I had." He glanced at her. "What's that?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Somewhere to run to," she said. He looked back at the road. His hand tightened once on the wheel and then relaxed. They drove the first hour in a companionable quiet that neither of them needed to fill. The ranch held in his absence the way a well-run operation holds, because Hector ran it as if Rhett were watching and Boyd ran it as if it were his own, and Danny Cole, whose medical curiosity had expanded under Mara's patient instruction into something that looked increasingly like a genuine calling, had started keeping a proper first aid log for the operation that was 3 times more thorough than anything they'd had before. These were not small things. They were the evidence of a place that had become something more than a collection of tasks performed by people who were paid to perform them. The weeks settled into months. The seasons turned over Wyoming in the way they always had. Summer burning off into a cool September. September giving way to the serious cold of October. The first snow arriving in early November, and the land going white and still in the way it went every year, muffled and vast, and in its own way peaceful. Mara had moved from the smokehouse into the main house in October, without ceremony or announcement, in the way things happen when they have already happened in every way that matters, and the physical arrangement is simply catching up. She and Rhett did not discuss it at length. They were not people who discussed things at length when the thing itself was clear. He had made room. She had taken it. The room felt to both of them like the right size. What they did discuss, at the kitchen table, on the porch, on the long drives out to check the cattle in the far pastures, was everything else. The things that had happened and the things they thought about them. His wife Laura, who he had not spoken of freely since her death, and who he found, with Mara, he could speak of with a fullness that was not grief exactly, but something that honored the grief without being consumed by it. Her mother, and what it had meant to lose her young. The clinic where she'd worked and what she'd loved about it, and whether that love was still intact under everything that had been piled on top of it. "Do you want to go back to it?" he asked one evening in November, with the snow coming down outside the window and the kitchen warm from the wood stove. Medicine. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. Not the same way, she said. I think what I want is to be useful in a way I choose." She was quiet for a moment. "Out here, the nearest clinic is 40 minutes. For the ranch hands, for the farms around the valley, when something goes wrong, it goes wrong before anyone can get there." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about whether there's a way to do something about that. Formally, with training, credentials." She paused. "It would take time. Things that are worth doing usually do," he said. She looked at him. "You'd be all right with the time it takes? The going back to school, the—" "Mara," he said. She stopped. "Do you want to do it?" he said. A pause. "Yes," she said. "Then do it," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." She looked at him for a long moment in the kitchen light. Then she picked up her coffee cup and looked at the window where the snow was coming down in the particular unhurried way of snow that intends to stay, and she said, "All right." And this time the word carried everything. The federal verdict came in March. Rhett was in the equipment shed when Mara came across the yard with her phone in her hand and her pace slightly faster than usual. Not running, but close. The barely contained speed of someone carrying something too significant to walk normally with. He saw her coming through the shed window and stepped out before she reached the door. She stopped in front of him. She held up the phone. On the screen was a message from the federal prosecutor. 3 sentences that Rhett read twice. Damian Blackridge's estate had been indicted on 17 counts, including financial fraud, coercion, witness tampering, and 2 counts of unlawful civil order procurement through judicial corruption. The judge who had issued the civil order against Mara was under separate federal investigation. All charges against Mara Ellison had been formally and permanently dismissed, and her legal identity fully restored with a notation in the federal record acknowledging the fraudulent nature of the name change imposed without her consent. He read it twice. Then he looked at her. Her face was doing something he had seen it do only once before. On the night in the barn when he'd found her with the mare, holding something enormous. But this time she was not turning away from it. She was standing in the cold March air in the yard of a Wyoming cattle ranch, and she was letting it arrive, all of it, the full weight of what it meant to have this done. Not over. The legal proceedings would continue for months. The depositions would be referenced and the evidence would be argued and the appeals process would grind through its paces, but done in the way that mattered most. The name was hers. The record was clear. The story of who she was had been given back to her. She pressed her lips together and looked up at the sky for a moment, and he saw the brightness in her eyes that she was not going to let fall because she was still Mara, and that was still not something she did without deciding to. Then she looked at him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. He opened his arms, not dramatically, not with any of the language of gesture that people use when they are performing emotion. Just opened them, the way a person opens a door. And she stepped into them, and he held her, and she let him. And they stood like that in the cold March yard for a long time, while the wind moved through the grass, and the horses were quiet in their stalls, and the land went on in every direction the way it always had. Indifferent and enormous and enduring. Hector found them there and turned around without a word, and went back to what he was doing, which was the most eloquent thing he had ever done. The spring that followed was the best working season the Callaway Ranch had seen in years, by every objective measure. The cattle came through the winter in good condition. The irrigation system that Mara had flagged in her first weeks, the one with the hairline crack she'd caught before it became a problem, had been replaced over the winter, and the water pressure through the south pasture was better than it had been in a decade. The fence line was sound. The equipment inventory was accurate and current, maintained now in Mara's precise handwriting in a binder that had replaced the ad hoc system that had preceded it. Danny Cole submitted his application to an emergency medical technician training program in Cody in April. He told Rhett about it with the careful nonchalance of someone who has made a significant decision and isn't sure how it will be received. Rhett looked at the application. Danny had evidently been working on it for some time. The personal statement section was 3 careful paragraphs long and said, "When do you start?" "September," Danny said. "If I get in." "You'll get in," Rhett said and handed it back. Danny looked at him. "I can still work the ranch on weekends and summers. I'm not looking to leave, Danny," Rhett said. The young man stopped. "This is a good thing," Rhett said. "Do it." Danny left the shed looking lighter than he'd entered it, which Rhett noted. That evening he told Mara about it at dinner. She set down her fork and looked at him with the private expression that was her version of open delight. "He asked me last week if I thought he was cut out for it," she said. "I told him that was the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "Whether he wanted to be," she said. "Turns out he does." She picked up her fork again. "He's going to be good at it." "I know," Rhett said. Boyd Emmons retired in June, not dramatically, in the way of a man who has worked 30 years and knows exactly when enough is enough. He told Rhett on a Tuesday morning with the same economy he applied to everything. "I'm going to my daughter's place in Amarillo," he said. "She's got kids now. I've been missing it." He looked at Rhett directly. "This has been the best operation I've worked. I want you to know that." Rhett shook his hand. "You built half of it." "Other half was already here," Boyd said. He looked across the yard to where Mara was working with Hector near the north barn. "Other half improved considerable." He drove out on a Friday with everything he owned in the bed of his truck and a new pair of boots he'd bought in town, and he waved once from the cab as he turned down the access road, and that was Boyd Emmons done, which was exactly how he would have wanted it. A neighboring rancher's son came on in his place, a young man named Pete Sorrell, 22, from the valley's eastern edge, who had heard about the Callaway Ranch through a chain of word of mouth that traced back to the night Blackridge's men had come and found something they hadn't expected. Pete Sorrell had sought out the work specifically. When Rhett asked him why, he said, with the directness of someone who has thought about what he wants to say, "Because I heard this is a place that treats people right." Rhett looked at him for a moment. Then he told him to be at the barn by 5:30. Mara enrolled in an advanced emergency medicine certification program through a university extension in September, the same week Danny started his EMT training. Their schedules occasionally overlapped and they sometimes carpooled on the longer drives, which produced a friendship that was easy and functional and occasionally involved Danny asking questions in the truck that Mara answered with the patient precision that had always been the quality of her at her best. She came home from those drives with the particular energy of someone doing work that fits, not the forced alertness of effort applied to things that don't come naturally, but the deep, renewable energy of a person engaged with something they were built for. She talked about her coursework at the kitchen table with an animation that she rarely showed about other things. She studied in the evenings with a focused intensity that Rhett recognized because it was the same intensity she'd brought to every fence post she'd ever set and every water tank she'd ever diagnosed. She was, when applied to medicine, extraordinary, and she was only beginning. In November, almost exactly 1 year after she had moved into the main house, Rhett came in from the late evening round to find her at the kitchen table with her coursework spread in front of her and a mug of coffee going cold beside her hand. She looked up when he came in, and something in her face told him she'd been waiting for him without knowing she was waiting. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and set her hand on top of his. Just that. No preamble, no language around it. Her hand on his, on the kitchen table in the November dark. He turned his hand over so that her hand was inside his, and he held it. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I don't have anywhere else, because this is where I want to be." He looked at her. "Then stay." "I'm serious, Rhett. I need you to hear it as a decision, not a circumstance." "I hear it," he said, "as a decision." She studied him. "You spent a long time building this place to not need anyone." "I know what I built," he said. "I know why." He paused. "And I know it's not enough. Turns out I needed someone to show me that." He looked at her directly. "You showed me that." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm going to be difficult sometimes." "I'm aware," he said. "I have a lot of—" She gestured at herself with her free hand, an unusual gesture, almost wry. "History. That doesn't disappear because the legal record is clear. I know that." "The nightmares are less," she said, but they're not gone. I know. And She paused. You're not exactly an easy person, Rhett Calloway. He almost smiled. Nobody's ever accused me of being easy. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind he had been seeing more of in recent months, and that still did to him what it had done the first time he'd seen it, which was make him understand that he'd been operating in reduced light for years without knowing it. All right, she said, for the last and most complete time. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment, and neither of them said anything further because there was nothing further necessary. They married the following spring in the front yard of the ranch, which was the only location that made sense to either of them. There were no large arrangements. Dunmore's name was on the guest list because Rhett had come to respect the man, and the federal prosecutor came down from Denver because Mara had come to consider her, in the careful way she considered things, a person worth keeping. Hector stood beside Rhett with the expression of a man who considers displays of emotion a private matter and is nonetheless clearly moved. Danny Cole, who had passed his EMT certification in February and wept about it alone in his truck in the parking lot before calling his mother, was there with his girlfriend and his healed hand and a new pair of boots he'd bought for the occasion. Pete Sorrell was there. The neighbors who had ridden in the night of Blackridge's attack were there. 3 families from the valley, standing in the grass in their good clothes, having driven the distance because some things are worth driving for. The ceremony was short. The words were plain. They meant them. The valley didn't forget what had happened at the Calloway Ranch the way places sometimes don't forget. It was not a legend that grew wilder with retelling. It stayed close to what it had been, which was specific and real and belonging to people who were still there. But it was known. It was part of what the valley understood about itself. That something had been tested here, and had held, and that the holding had meant something. The clinic Mara had been thinking about for a year and a half opened 3 years after she completed her certification in a converted building on the edge of the nearest town. It was small, practical, equipped with the precision of someone who understood both necessity and resource. She ran it 2 days a week and was on call for emergencies the rest of the time. And in the first 18 months, she saw 140 patients from the valley and the surrounding country, most of whom had been managing without anyone closer than 40 minutes. Danny Cole, who had gone on to paramedic training after his EMT certification, worked with her on the emergency call schedule. The gray mare from the ranch had contributed, in the only way livestock contribute to such things, by living long enough to see it happen. On a morning in early summer, 4 years after Mara Ellison had limped up a lonely Wyoming road with a canvas bag on her shoulder and a silence around her like armor, Rhett Calloway stood on the porch of his house and looked out at his land. The land was the same land, red rock to the west, blue hills to the north, grass running in every direction under a sky that had never, in all the years he'd stood under it, looked less than enormous. The fence line was sound. The cattle were in the south pasture and would need moving by afternoon. The equipment shed was stocked, and the water pressure was good, and the irrigation system was running the way a properly maintained system runs. Quietly, without drama, doing what it was built to do. All of this was the same, and through the kitchen window behind him, he could hear Mara on the phone. She was talking to a patient, her voice in the particular register it used for clinical conversations, clear, grounded, specific, and kind. He could hear her moving around the kitchen while she talked, coffee going, the small ordinary sounds of a person at home in their life. And somewhere from the direction of the bunkhouse came the sound of Pete Sorrell getting the horses out for morning, his voice low and comfortable with the animals, and Hector's truck pulling in from the early perimeter check, the engine cutting off, the door opening and closing. The ranch was full of sounds. Rhett stood on the porch and listened to all of them, and he felt the weight of the morning the way a person feels the weight of something good. Not lightly, not casually, but with the full attention of someone who knows the difference between having something and having almost not had it. He had spent 9 years building a life with nothing in it that could be taken. He had succeeded, completely, in that goal. He had woken up every morning to something that would not leave him, could not leave him, because he had arranged it to be incapable of doing so. He had been safe in the way that empty places are safe, entirely, and to no purpose. She had walked up his road with nothing and changed the arithmetic of everything. He thought about what Boyd had said in his last week at the ranch when Rhett had walked him to his truck, and they had stood for a moment in the early morning quiet that had preceded his departure. Boyd had said, in the unhurried way he said the few things he said, "You know what this place was missing before, Rhett?" Rhett had said he didn't. "It was a good ranch," Boyd had said, but it wasn't a home yet. He had driven out, and Rhett had stood in the yard with that sentence for a long time. It was a home now. That was the simplest and most complete way to say it, and both the simplicity and the completeness were, after everything, exactly right. The kitchen door opened behind him. Mara stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, phone call done. She stood beside him and looked out at the same view he was looking at. In the full morning light of that early summer day, she looked like what she was, a woman at rest, not defeated into stillness, not hiding in it, simply resting, present, here. "Pete's got the horses," she said. "I heard. The Hendersons' youngest came in yesterday," she said. "Rope burn on both hands from the new stock fence. He tried to tell me it didn't hurt." "Did you tell him it did?" "I told him it would hurt less tomorrow," she said. "Which is more useful." She sipped her coffee. "Danny's coming Friday to go over the emergency protocol with me. He wants to add the sorrel farm to the call radius." "Good idea," Rhett said. She nodded, looking out at the land. A hawk was working the thermals over the western pasture, high and effortless and unhurried. The grass moved in the morning wind in long, slow waves that ran from north to south and made the land look alive in a way it always was, but that was most visible from this particular porch at this particular hour. Mara reached over without looking, and her hand found his, the way things find their place when they've done it enough times. He held it. After a moment, she said, quietly, not dramatically, the way she said things that mattered, "I used to think that surviving was the same as living." He looked at her. She was still looking at the land. "It isn't," she said. "Turns out they're completely different things." He thought about 9 years of careful, deliberate, impenetrable survival. He thought about a woman limping up a road in the heat of a Wyoming summer with everything she had left in a canvas bag. He thought about a gray mare with her head on a shoulder, and a fence post set right, and a composition notebook and a succession of hiding places, and the cold specific sound of a single shot in the dark, and a letter with a name on it. Her name, her real name, returned to her after years of being held hostage. And a kitchen table in November, and a hand turning over inside another hand. "No," he said. "They're not." The hawk banked over the western pasture and caught a thermal and went up without effort, up into the enormous Wyoming sky, and was for a moment a dark point against all that blue. And then it wasn't. It was just the sky, and the land, and the morning, and the two of them standing on the porch of a home that had been a long time in the making and was not going anywhere. The ranch endured, the valley remembered, and the people who had stood together in the dark on the worst night of all of it lived forward into days that kept getting better, the way days will when the people living them have decided, with everything they are, that they deserve to.